Hi, Power Hour listeners. This is Alex Epstein, host of Power Hour, introducing another Best of Power Hour. As I've mentioned in previous weeks, I'm working on the Moral Case for Fossil Fuels 2.0, and my co-hosts Don Watkins and Stefan Henna are working on it with me, so we are sharing some of our favorite previous episodes. Today's episode is the episode I did with someone named Brendan O'Neill, who's the editor of Spiked Online, and it's about humanism versus anti-humanism. I highly recommend checking out Spiked Online. You can just those words on Twitter is a good Twitter handle, and you can find lots of things from them. And what I really appreciate about Brendan and about Spiked is that they have a deeply human focus on the modern world and on the role of fossil fuels in the modern world. And this resonates very much with me. And just as I've been looking over recently at different things Brendan has been involved with, he's had interesting comments on Greta Thunberg, the Swedish teenage activist, and has a show where he gives really interesting commentary on the environmental movement. A thought just that occurs to me in connection with him and connection with other pro-human thinkers is just the thought that Earth has never been a better place for human beings to live. Just think about that. Earth has never been a better place for human beings to live. So when people talk about we're destroying the planet, we've ruined the environment, they're not talking about it from a human perspective, because from a human perspective, whatever has been negative has been overwhelmed by that which has been positive. So the first thing to say, if you are actually concerned about the human environment, so the world, the environment from a human perspective, is, oh my gosh, the world we have created is amazing. Now we can do things better and we can be concerned about certain things in the future, but if we don't acknowledge how amazing the world is today, then we're either ignorant or we are anti-human. And so in today's discussion, or the discussion that I'm sharing today, you're going to hear, I think, a really pro-human thinker who has a very refreshing perspective. Also, you'll see he comes from what he calls the left. So that's an interesting kind of background too. But what he means by the left is probably very different from what you think of as the left. So I hope you enjoy this episode with Brendan O'Neill on humanism versus anti-humanism.
Power Hour. Coal. Oil. Natural gas. Power Hour, the show where today's top energy experts break down today's top energy issues. No sound bites, no talking points, no nonsense, no BS, no softball questions, no vagueness, just in-depth analysis and ruthless clarity. Power Hour. Here's your host, Alex Epstein.
Welcome to Power Hour. I'm your host, Alex Epstein. Today on the show, we're going to talk to Brendan O'Neill, who's the editor of Spiked Online, which is a fascinating publication, which you'll learn about in a minute, that I just discovered recently, but that has some of the best pro-human, pro-industry content I've seen anywhere. Lots of really well-written stuff, just really cool stuff to read, even in cases where I don't fully agree. So as a nonfiction writer, as my primary occupation, it's always fun to meet or meet through reading a nonfiction writer who's truly interesting and writes genuinely insightful things that aren't just derivative. And so reading Brendan's stuff this morning, I didn't even go to the beach. At least I didn't go to the beach at the time I used to, because I was really occupied with his book, A Duty to Offend. So we'll talk with Brendan about his book, about Spiked, and about humanism versus anti-humanism. So stick with us. Oh, and one more thing. I'm recording this after I recorded my interview with Brendan, so I can guarantee it's worth listening to. But we did have some connection issues, so my voice should be fine. His voice will occasionally get a little bit garbled, but the content should be totally clear. So bear with us, and in the future we'll investigate how to prevent this sort of thing from happening. All right, we'll be joined by Brendan O'Neill on the other side.
Power Hour, because what you don't know about energy can kill you. Here's Alex Epstein.
We're now joined by Brendan O'Neill, editor of Spiked Online. Brendan, welcome to Power Hour.
Hi, Alex.
It's good to have you on. So I discovered Spiked online maybe 2 months ago when a friend of mine, and actually a senior fellow now at Center for Industrial Progress, Pierre Desrochers, was just telling me, hey, you know about these guys Spiked, right? They've got really interesting views that you would like. And even though, at least historically, they come from the left. And I said, no, I've never heard of them. And then I started reading it, and I was pretty astonished as to well, how similar, I mean, it's self-serving to say, but how similar some of the stuff was, but also how good it was. We'll talk a little bit about it in connection with your new book. I think just good writing is very rare. It's rare that there aren't that many nonfiction authors that I just will read for pleasure. So reading your book is fun. So we'll get to that in a second. But so what is Spiked and where does it come from? Because when people read some of the ideas, they'll think either that I ripped you off or you ripped me off. Which your stuff is older, so you definitely didn't rip me off.
Right, so Spiked is a daily online magazine. We come from a kind of left-wing background, although we wouldn't necessarily describe ourselves as left-wing today. Some people call us Marxist libertarians because we have that kind of lefty background, but we're also very interested in liberty, freedom, autonomy, things that left-wing people unfortunately aren't particularly interested in anymore. And we write about progress, growth, the importance of freedom of speech. All of those are our kind of core values. More economic growth, the need for greater human progress, and the right of people to think and say whatever they want.
So I want to push on this idea of coming from the left, because if you talk about, well, people from the left value certain things, well, I mean, historically, you can say to some extent in the United States there is a value of liberty in the more spiritual realm, personal realm, in terms of people standing up for things like getting religion out of government and freedom of speech, at least the American left in the United States. But in the realm of economic activity and of production, in the United States at least, and well, certainly in all the socialist countries around the world, there was the opposite of liberty. So in what way do you say that the left should be concerned with liberty?
Well, we see ourselves as coming from a very old left-wing tradition, the kind of left who would sit on the left side of the French National Assembly after the Revolution, which is where the term the left comes from. You know, the people who sat on the left side were very pro-reason, very pro-liberty, very pro-enlightenment, that kind of really early form of left-wing politics, which lost its way over the years, but it was there at the very beginning. And in relation to economic growth and industry, I'm always struck whenever I reread the Communist Manifesto, which I try and do at least once every 6 months to keep myself sane. It's amazing how much space Marx and Engels devote to praising the bourgeoisie and the capitalist class for their economic growth and for the way in which they transformed the world. And in fact, Marx and Engels sing the praises of them for developing international trade, for moving people out of the country and into the cities. And they really celebrate for about 10 pages the wonders created by capitalism. And then, of course, they go on to say it's not enough, it hampers, it makes people feel alienated, it needs to be overthrown, and so on and so forth. But they recognize that there was something really important in that kind of early burst of industrial growth. And I think that's the kind of left-wing view that we also look back to, which is one that was very much in favor of more economic growth, more industry, in order to liberate more people from poverty.
What you mentioned about Marx in regard to celebrating the conquest of poverty and more broadly what I'd call the transformation of nature, the industrialization of the world, it is remarkable looking back to that, because I mean, so much of my own focus of Marx when I've read the Communist Manifesto has been on the elements going against economic freedom and going against capitalism, and yet, looking at him or looking at Engels, I almost start to like them in the sense, which would be inconceivable to me in the past, in the sense that if you think of it as capitalism and socialism are at least both attempts at humanism, at human beings benefiting in one way or another, and then they're defining it different ways, and there are different means to it, and I disagree with one of them profoundly in the end. But what we have in the modern world is a whole philosophy that's not even claiming to be concerned about human well-being, except in this incredibly derivative way of, if you are the parasite slash polluter of the earth, and so in addition to ruining all the other precious species that you should care about more than yourself, you'll also ruin your own life, by the way. But it's not like any sort of theory about how to benefit human well-being, and so it's fascinating to look back at some of these thinkers that I think of as anti-capitalist, but they're much more pro-humanist and also much more pro development or pro transformation is maybe more fundamental. Like I remember Engels has this really interesting criticism of Malthus, right? I mean, you see these guys like back, and people don't realize that. So I remember reading about that in Merchants of Despair by Robert Zubrin, and just being fascinated. So how, in terms of your own journey, how did you start out, and when did you become interested in this issue of humanism versus anti-humanism, or humanism versus environmentalism?
Well, I started out in getting involved in left-wing politics about 20 years ago when I was quite young, and I started writing for a magazine called Living Marxism, which was the precursor magazine to Spiked. It was a monthly print magazine, and people who worked for Living Marxism, me and a few others, just became increasingly agitated with the left for precisely the reasons you've outlined, which is that they seem to forget their original mission of expanding the human footprint and increasing economic growth and calling for more jobs, more industry, less poverty. The kind of things that the left did for decades seem to have been forgotten over the past 20 years as the left embraced the kind of misanthropic Malthusian politics of environmentalism, which is much more about protecting nature from rapacious mankind than it is about allowing mankind to flourish and to grow and to have more comfort and more wealth. So that was my kind of origin. I started out on the radical left in Britain and just became more disappointed with the direction the left was moving in. I remember very early on, when I was first doing radical politics around 1992, I was really struck by how many people of my age, I was, I guess, 18 at the time, were getting involved in the anti-roads protests, and they were all tying themselves to trees and demanding...
What are the anti-roads protests?
Anti-roads protests were an attempt to stop the building of new roads and new motorways around Britain in order to save the environment from all the pollution that would be created. So you had all these people who considered themselves radical, tying themselves to trees, living in trees for months on end so that they wouldn't be cut down, stopping people from laying down tarmac, stopping people from creating these new roads for cars to drive on. And I remember thinking, what's going on here? You know, I thought the left was about fighting racism or demanding more economic growth or talking about national liberation or whatever issues used to be concern to the left had seemed to just give way to this new movement, which was about stopping progress. I remember that was a very early turning point for me, thinking, you know, the left has definitely lost the plot here, so we need to rethink what it means to be left-wing today.
So in retrospect, or maybe you thought of this at the time, what's your explanation? Because the new left has become dominant in the within the left, in the United States, let alone in Europe, where it's even worse.
Absolutely, that new problematic left has won the argument really with the old left, and the old left is kind of dying out and is actually irrelevant now. I think a lot of its old arguments don't really stand for much in the 21st century. So that new misanthropic left has definitely won. And the way I would try to deal with it, I look back at some of the Marxist writings on Malthus, because as you say, Engels and also Marx himself wrote a lot in Malthus. And in fact, so did some early Russian revolutionaries, some of the people who ended up dead at the hands of Stalin in the 1930s. In the early 20th century, a lot of those Russian revolutionaries wrote some very good stuff about Malthus. And what they all talked about was this really bad tendency to try to naturalize poverty, to say that this argument which came from Malthus originally, which was the idea that the reason people are poor, the reason they haven't got enough to eat, is because nature only gives us so much. So it's nature's fault. It's a natural problem, and therefore we have to curb human population. And, the left defined itself for a century and a half in direct opposition to that idea. They said there's nothing natural about poverty. We can grow our way out of it. We can develop our way out of it. We can expand people's opportunities. And then what you have over the past 20 years is the left completely doing a complete flip reversal and embracing those early Malthusian arguments. So, and I think the reason that has become the dominant outlook is not simply because the left has become or not simply because of groups like Greenpeace, but more importantly, I think, because the other side in the argument, which is the free market side or the right-wing side, has actually caved in on a lot of these questions and have opened the door to precisely those kind of arguments. And I often think that modern anti-capitalism is actually a product of capitalism itself, and particularly of capitalism having lost faith in its old mission to remake the world. I think very often capitalism itself sends the signal that it is a rotten one, which invites all this kind of new left critique.
So here's an add-on to the question, just because I have my own views, but you have in the last 40 years, I'd say, in particular, just refutation after refutation of the anti-humanist worldview. I mean, you have, if man is viewed as a parasite and polluter, you have an amazing era of wealth creation where well-being is spreading around the globe. You have the transformation of multiple non-resources into resources, and you have in particular the industrialized nations making their environments better and better. So why is it then that now is the time? It's not as if this arose, say, at the time where there was lots of pollution from new oil wells. It's not like environmentalism rose then, when in a sense you'd have much more reason to at least be concerned about pollution because stuff was being dumped all over the place. Now it's insanely pristine, and yet it's completely overtaken the left. So why do you think that is?
Well, that's the great conundrum of our times, this question of why, at precisely a time when human life is improving enormously and has improved enormously, you have this extremely downbeat, pessimistic, anti-human outlook. And, I always think of China, in China, where there has been huge economic leaps forward, where millions of people have been lifted out of absolute poverty and have moved into cities and are basically going through a similar experience to what England went through 150 or 200 years ago, except on a far vaster scale. And yet people look at that and they only see the negative impact. They only see what it's doing to rivers or how many grey sky days there are in Beijing. They're incapable of seeing the positive effects on human life of those kind of leaps forward. So it's the great question of our age. Why are people so miserablest in a time in which things are getting better for huge numbers of human beings? And I think what that demonstrates is that this is an ideology which is immune in many ways to facts or figures or evidence. It's ironic that environmentalists will often accuse climate change deniers of not listening to facts and not taking on board information, when in fact it's precisely these people, these Greens, who seem incapable of looking at the state of the world and understanding it in a rational way. I think it comes in large part from the events of the 1970s, the oil crisis, the crash, the discussion that gave rise to, which was very interesting. It didn't give rise to a discussion of, well, how can we recover from this and what do we need to do? It gave rise to a whole new outlook which said, well, maybe we've gone too far. You have the whole Club of Rome movement. You have the birth of the neo-Malthusianism. You have the rise of all these backward, quite poisonous arguments, which basically said, well, maybe humanity has done too much. Maybe it's time to rein in. Maybe it's time to curb numbers and have a bit more population growth. I think from the 70s onwards, you have this kind of extremely downbeat view of humankind. Even through the 80s, even under Thatcherism and Reaganism, you see the continued growth of this very pessimistic worldview. And 40, 50 years later, it's become the dominant worldview because I think there isn't enough people challenging it.
The example of China really sticks out at me in that people can't they can't think of it positively, even though we had a guest on last week talking about the average life expectancy in Beijing is over 80. Like you have these, and overall life is so much better, but people's view of the world is so skewed that all they can see is waste. It's just like there should be a world. Human beings are the only things that create waste in this view, and it's just like the world should be. Our whole focus should be: have we scrubbed the waste of human beings? And ultimately, the leaders want to scrub human beings off the planet. But you just can't see it as okay. Yeah, sometimes it's smoggy outside, and that's unpleasant. But I have air conditioning, and I actually have food, and I can actually do a job that's interesting, and I'm choosing to live here. I don't think people realize that this is not that people are being. It's not like World War II where you're like forced into the army. This is people leaving the countryside and being much better off, and that just that skewed perspective. So I'm curious if you have any more thoughts on how that works, because it's so perverse that if you can't see the good in that situation.
Yeah, it's really perverse, and I think it speaks to the way in which human beings are now seen entirely as consumers, as people who use up resources, and effectively as a drain on the planet or a pox on the planet, a plague. The more extreme green elements will describe us as a plague, who are a disease that are destroying this ball flying through space. And when you see people as a drain, as simply as consumers, then you will develop a very misanthropic mindset, and you will see every new building as a kind of a rape of the planet. That's how people perceive of these things. And what they fail to understand, of course, is that humans aren't just consumers, they're also producers. We make things, we build things, we create things, we discover new resources, we discover new uses for old resources. They're incapable of seeing the creative side of mankind because they're so obsessed with the destructive side of mankind, which they exaggerate hugely. And I think once you've adopted that ideological mindset that human beings are mouths to feed, rather than also being brains that can think and hands that can work. If you just see human beings as mouths to feed, then you will always worry when there are more human beings. You will always worry when huge new cities are built with millions of people teeming in them. And so I think it springs from that extremely anti-human worldview that has developed in recent decades. And I think the example of China is a really good one, because there's also a real raise the drawbridge element to this, because what you have are people who live in the relatively comfortable West, whose nations are often built on industrial revolutions and nuclear revolutions, who live comfortably, who have iPhones, who spend all their days tweeting because they've got so much spare time, and they look at somewhere like China or India and countries which are going through those industrial leaps forward, and they tut and they sneer and they say, well, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't make the mistakes we made. I think that's a really arrogant, irritating approach that they take to the third world, which is simply trying to catch up with the kind of comfort that we enjoy. So there's also that real anti-capitalism has become not so much radical, but an expression of a kind of privileged narcissism amongst many in the West, who, even as they live these very comfortable long lives, even as they benefit from what capitalism has done over the past 150 years, they will sneer at any development of it in other parts of the world. I find that really grating.
All right. I want to raise a big issue in a second, but just to give people a flavor of your book. Brendan? What is your book called?
A duty to offend.
A duty to offend. So this is you look at the table. You can get this on Amazon. If you look at the table of contents of this book, it is it would be hard for somebody not to be interested in at least one of the topics. So number one is called. These are not all Power Hour focused topics, but we have drunk sex, Marxists for capitalism, bringing Spinoza back. But then there are a couple of ones that are directly relevant to the issue of humanism, and particularly coal pride, Earth is not finite, and then I'm looking at the others. Well, in any case, I want to just read people a couple of excerpts because this is really well written, and not many things are well written, and certainly not many things are well written and in favor of human beings. So it's a combination I appreciate. So I'll just read a couple of excerpts for my own entertainment and to encourage people to check this out. And some of it also Spiked Online has some of these essays, but. So he says, why are so many Australians so sniffy about the coal industry? Everywhere I go, I meet someone who has a beef with the black stuff. And it isn't just the usual suspects. Those green-hearted weepers for Gaia who think any kind of rummaging in the earth for combustible resources is a crime against nature, and who are hilariously unaware that their unproductive lives of tweeting and thrift shopping would be impossible if a couple of 100 years ago man hadn't burnt copious amounts of coal and in the process invented the modern world. I like that sentence just has, I don't know, I had an interesting experience where somebody once asked me, how do you, as commenting, I really understood someone well, and I said, how do you understand me well? And I was thinking about it later, and it's not that I'm good at understanding people, it's that I can read a lot into writing. Like, I can read from every word how much someone needed to understand to read that word. So it's really, really fun to read, because you can tell, wow, this guy's really thought about this. Even just the deliberate use of the word rummaging, which is how productive activity is viewed. There's another one. There's a line that I mean, like this kind of thing. You almost never get this. I don't get this because, to my mind, Australia's coal industry is a wondrous, jaw-dropping thing. It should surely stir the heart that Australia unearthed so much of this blackest of minerals, which has eons-old sunlight trapped within it, and then exports it by the shipload to China and elsewhere where the sunlight is unlocked and used to power progress and development. I mean, that is just, it's so true, but nobody sees it. They don't see it that way. This goes to the whole philosophy where you have, a friend of mine who works in the oil industry described it as, people have been taught that food is poison and poison is food. And they've been taught that creation is destruction and destruction is creation. So
that's
anyway,
right.
So this is. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that Cole sums that up perfectly, because what you have here is one of the most amazing things we've ever done, which is to unlock the ancient sunlight lying dormant in this kind of mineral and used it to power whole new industries. And yet the only thing people will say about coal is that digging for it is destructive and burning it is destructive. It really speaks to that inability to see the positive in anything at all, even something as wondrous as using this mineral to create whole new factories, cities, ways of life. It's a really wondrous thing.
Yeah, just one more sentence that I love, particularly the part embedded within M dashes. Coal, you see, M dash, or more accurately, I don't know if people even know what M dash is, but, or more accurately, man's discovery of its inner powers was one of the great liberators of mankind. So that is exactly what 99% of people who talk about coal don't get, which is that it's the real achievement is it's not really about coal, it's about the coal industry. It's about man's manipulating this otherwise useless thing for his purposes in this magnificent way. Because people talk about, count on coal, and coal can do that, but they make unaltered nature the star versus intelligent transformation the star.
That's right. And the other thing that they completely overlook is the knock-on effect that these discoveries have on everyday life. Not only do they create jobs and new industries, but then when you have a mass movement of people from the country to the city, as we had in the Industrial Revolution in England and as is happening in other parts of the world now, you have a situation where people start to say, well, we need schools actually so that we can educate our children, and actually we don't want our children to work anymore, so we've got to get them down from the chimneys and stop them being exploited, and we think we should have the right to vote, and we think maybe women should be allowed to work as well. All these things were direct consequences of something that was started by the Industrial Revolution, which was a huge movement of people, which is why I always think the Industrial Revolution is so far the single most important moment in human history. Not only because of all the new stuff that was created as a result of it, but because it's exactly around that time that you have the birth of new cities, new movements, new social movements, new forms of democracy. All that good stuff comes in large part from what was done by the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, and it's interesting how, I think, not just interesting, but mistaken how the Industrial Revolution is viewed as almost this just a finite period of time that ended like the Eisenhower era or something like that. Like, oh, we had the Industrial Revolution, and now we have the Information Revolution, as if the Information Revolution isn't the product of transforming nature in new ways and also building on the old ways. So here's the big issue I want to talk about for the rest of the time, which is the philosophy driving this opposition to to man's development of nature and ultimately to man, but in particular the lack of a positive philosophy offered by the pro-capitalist, pro-human side, since both of us are trying to do this in different ways. But I think it's worth pointing out that there is a whole developed philosophy and at least associated pseudoscience posing as science of anti-humanism, and I like to divide it into the man as the parasite slash polluter. Those are sort of the two ways in which he ruins the planet, and then by extension his own life. So he's exceeding his carrying capacity, depriving himself of these finite resources, and then he's also despoiling it. He's also ruining it, poisoning all the other species, and ultimately poisoning himself. You mentioned that the right or the pro-capitalist side hasn't fought back against that, but one thing I'd note is that most of them have not really thought about the core issue underlying it. And this is what I'll say. There is a legitimate issue underlying what the anti-humanists are doing. They're taking one approach, which is a wrong approach, but there is an issue of what should be the relationship between man and the rest of nature, and how does that impact man's long-term survival. Because if you look at a lot of these criticisms of what human beings do under capitalism, it's, well, you're ruining the environment that you depend on. You're overstepping your bounds. Yes, there's going to be some waste, but that absolutely needs to be minimized. And there's going to be some consumption, but that absolutely needs to be minimized. And if you don't, then you're disrupting the ecosystem that you depend on, and then you're going to get ruined. So, and particularly in the long term. So this issue of concern with like the wide-ranging impacts and the long-ranging impacts of what we do, and defining our proper relationship to nature in relation to those, that's a real issue. And one of my theses is that the pro-capitalist side has not, for the most part, articulated anything coherent. They've mostly been reactive. So I'm curious what you think of that.
Well, I think to the extent that human beings have to be conscious of their impact on the environment, or conscious of whether they're creating pollution or too much smog, as they have done throughout history in various different ways, I think that's true, but it needs to be completely disentangled from the politics of environmentalism, because that, I would argue, is about something completely different. It might dress itself up as a war on pollution, or an attempt to clean our rivers, or an attempt to lessen the human footprint, but it's fundamentally driven by an ideological, political view of economic growth as a bad thing, as human beings, as essentially just pollutants, and as nature as this kind of thing that we should worship and tiptoe around. So this is the problem we face. Undoubtedly environmental problems in the world. I mean, you think of London in the 1950s when there was a great smog. I mean, it was really bad and it was very dangerous for people's health. There are similar situations in China now. The 3 times I've been to China, I have been struck by the fact that there are days when you can't see the buildings around you because the air is very thick and very grey. So these are problems, but I think the politics of environmentalism actually make them more difficult for us to tackle. Firstly, because they turn what ought to be discrete problems into these kind of cosmic end of the world issues that should freak us all out. So they exaggerate the problem itself. And also they overlook the fact that the more growth there is, the more progressive a society is, the more wealthy it is, then the more able it is to deal with these economic problems, these environmental problems. So I think it's important to think about how these things can be addressed, but the problem that we have today, which goes for the pro-capitalist side in this argument as well, is that they have brought much into the politics of environmentalism rather than treating these as discrete issues that need just some rational tackling rather than hand-wringing. And I think the pro-capitalist side has given a green light to environmentalism and has invited it and incited it actually to become bigger and bigger. And I'm always struck by the cowardice of modern capitalists who seem incapable or unwilling to stand up for the great gains they have made and spend their whole time self-flagellating and apologising and inviting officials from Greenpeace to lecture them about how they can clean up their act. I think you need less of that kind of apologism and more of a forthright defence of what we've done over the past 100 years.
All right, I want to push back on that a little bit, or emphasize that kind of angle I'm trying to take. So there's a traditional view that that there are real environmental problems in the world, but environmentalists are not truly concerned about those, and that is absolutely true. That is absolutely true. What I'm trying to get at is maybe a deeper issue, which is that there are not so much discrete problems, but there are real questions, philosophical questions, among other questions, about how, on a fundamental level, we should relate to our environment. What is the proper relationship between man and the rest of nature? And in your writing and in my work, there's explicit or at least implicit viewpoints on, for instance, you talk about expanding the human footprint and that being a good thing. But there's a certain philosophy behind that. And I think a lot of what's necessary for that philosophy was actually in previous thinkers who lived much closer to nature and who saw the difference between unindustrialized and industrialized nature. But I think today, one of my criticisms of the right is and this includes the energy companies, you can view it as, well, they're not courageous, right? The Greenpeace is obviously trying to extort them, and Greenpeace is obviously corrupt, and yet they're bowing to Greenpeace. And that is true. There's an element of cowardice, and if you have self-esteem, you shouldn't bow to it. But I think more fundamentally, there's a philosophy of environment, which environmentalism has had a monopoly on, which undercuts your self-esteem because it defines you as a parasite polluter, and it's not like they have the opposite view of man as the creator improver. It's not that that's something that's taught or that that's understood, and there are a couple of other elements too, but that's my view, and that's part of why I'm excited to have you on and to spread your work, because I feel like there needs to be an explicit humanist philosophy of man and nature. And right now it's being dominated by the environmentalist, which really means anti-humanist philosophy.
Yeah, and I think, I love nature. I think it's great. I love going for walks in nature. That's all wonderful. But the problem with environmentalism is actually that it alienates man from nature even more, because it treats man as this pollutant whose engagement with nature is necessarily going to have a devastating impact. And so it actually, ironically, creates a scenario where there is more distance between man and his natural environment, or suddenly more caution, more trepidation, this fear of being too involved in nature and seeing ourselves as a threat to it. So it creates this whole new ideology, a new philosophy in a way, which takes us away from nature in a very new way. My philosophy is one that comes much more from the Enlightenment and the scientific revolutionary Francis Bacon, who said rather crudely that we need to extract nature's secrets. And what he and others meant when they said that in the 1600s and the 1700s was that we need to understand nature more. We shouldn't see it as this terrifying mystical force. We need to tame it. We need to explore it. We need to challenge it sometimes, and sometimes we need to defeat it. And the way I see it is that we humanize nature, and we hold back some of its bad traits. For example, tsunamis and earthquakes and so on. The more that we can protect ourselves against nature's whims, the better. But also, we enjoy nature and we engage with it at that level too. So my philosophy is one which is a part, but he's also superior to nature, and he is separate from it because he's the only creature on Earth who has the ability to understand nature and to measure it. The more that we have that attitude, the more we will be able to exploit, to use an unfashionable word, nature's resources, while at the same time being able to appreciate nature's beauty. The problem with environmentalism is that it prevents us in many ways from doing both of those things. It doesn't want us to exploit nature's resources. It really wants to keep us away from nature because it thinks everything we do will have a detrimental impact. So we need to recover the philosophical view of human beings as being natural creatures, but also something more than that. And that's not something we should be ashamed of.
Yeah, I often like to think of it as the best part of nature. Yeah, because there is this nature is a weird concept because I sometimes refer to it as the rest of nature, because there's this view that we're somehow outside it, and I mean there is a useful perspective of differentiating the non-man-made from the man-made, but there is this alienation, and I want to talk more about this because I think it's so psychologically damaging that it's this, if you've ever seen these diagrams of the planet, diagrams is too sophisticated, but like the cartoons where we're making the planet sick, right? And like, oh, you're infected, the planet, the doctor says to the planet, I don't know where the doctor comes from, but you're infected with humans. You have humans, and, the view of a cancer, like it's obviously such an anti-humanist perspective to analogize humans to a cancer, because obviously the thing that you call a cancer is much less important, to say the least, than the thing that's afflicted with the cancer, and obviously it's not humans who are afflicted with the cancer. But so I just want to any other thoughts on alienation's particular? Well, I'm curious what you think of just if you don't understand how great humans are, then I think it's related to just an alienation people feel from the world, that they don't understand it at all. Because how can you understand the world of technology if you don't understand the beneficent nature of man's transformation? If you really just view man as a parasite, what the hell do you think is going on around you, and how in control can you feel of your life, and how good can you feel about the world?
Yeah, I think absolutely. The politics of environmentalism, or the new anti-humanism, I think has a devastating impact on how people conceive of themselves and how they relate to each other and how they relate to the world around them. Because if people are viewed as pollutants, then they are going to live this extremely guilt-ridden life. And we see that with the ritual of recycling, or the way in which people will offset their carbon. They'll take a flight somewhere and then they will pay me to plant 40 trees. It's like a new form of penance. I grew up a Catholic, so I remember what it's like, where anything bad that you did, you had to pay for it quickly. So you live your whole life in the state of concern and agitation and discomfort, really. And I think that's been recreated around the politics of environmentalism. People, they still do most of the stuff they want to do. They have families, they drive cars to the supermarket, they buy nice food that's been flown halfway around the world. They still do that, but they feel bad about it. And they wonder, should they be doing it? So it just creates this sense of unease, I think, across the world, particularly in the West, this sense of unease about daily life. And so it alienates people from nature, because we're all taught that we are a threat to nature, but it also alienates us from each other and from the wonderful gains that have been made over the past 200 odd years, which have allowed us to live these very comfortable, long lives, and yet we're encouraged to feel bad about that. And I think it's really summed up. There was a campaign a few years ago for everyone to achieve water neutrality, which is where every drop of water you drink or use to wash yourself, you would offset it by doing something for the environment. And I just thought to myself, well, there's another word for water neutrality, which is death.
One more thing I'm interested in hearing on you elaborate on a little bit, particularly because you've read different 19th century. You're familiar with some of the history of the humanist view of nature, which I think it's just so great to read a lot of those older materials. And those people were much closer to unaltered nature than we are. So they had a much more rational perspective. I mean, there's no, almost no Greenpeace mentality back then, when you actually have to live in and with the rest of nature, without really the ability to master it. What about the issue of I think what used to be people's positive enthusiasm about transforming nature and about man's great creations? You hear stories about people celebrating taming a continent, or cheering when a bridge is built. And there's so much that we should be cheering about that we're doing, and yet instead, if we take something like agriculture, we have these companies like Monsanto that have fed millions or billions of people, and nobody is enthralled by it at all. And in fact, it's just an easy whipping boy if you're any kind of major industrial force in the world. Can you just contrast today to what it used to be like in terms of people's enthusiasm? Because we are creators. That's what we spend our lives doing. And if we don't appreciate that and enjoy that, what does that do to our whole lives?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And if you look back to all the forms of technology that man has created in the past, with ships that were capable of crossing oceans, or rocks that could fly to the moon, all that stuff was seen very positively at the time, even though it involved a huge amount of risk. I mean, setting sail in the 1400s across the ocean, not knowing what was at the other side, must have been a genuinely terrifying thing to do, but it was encouraged, it was celebrated, it led to huge discoveries. I'm always struck by the fact that there are only about 50 years between man's discovery of flight and his ability to fly, and then landing on the moon. These things moved very quickly, and the reason they moved very quickly is because there was a climate in which they were seen as positive, good things to do, in which they were celebrated, in which millions upon millions of people would sit down and watch the moon landing and talk about it and celebrate that as a wonderful development and a wonderful form of exploration. What you have now is just a far more downbeat attitude to every form of progress that takes place. You can have a situation where, as you say, something like GM is invented, where mankind has the ability to interfere with nature at a very intricate level to create crops that will defy the weather and continue to grow, or which contain the right kind of vitamins to prevent people from getting bad eyesight or losing their sight. Man can now manipulate crops in order to improve human life and the length of human life. And yet the response to that amongst these kind of Western miserabilists is to treat it as terrible, evil, dangerous, wicked. In Britain, eco-activists have actually broken into GM laboratories and smashed up their crops and burnt down their crops. I mean, real backward stuff, medieval attacks going on this new form of technology. So that, I think, is one of the depressing aspects of our age, which is that these discoveries are still being made, new forms of progress are still being pursued, industry continues, but there's no social, political validation for that. So it continues out of necessity, because we still need all this stuff, and yet we seem incapable of validating it at the political level, at the cultural level, at the social level. And that, I think, is what we need to repair. The fact that this stuff is going on, human life continues to improve, but what we need now is a more conscious celebration of that as a thing, not just as a necessary thing, not just as a burden we have to put up with, but as a thing that is worthy of celebration.
I think that's so important, and there is an analogy that's at least a decent analogy that I just thought of, I hope, which is that you often hear, and it's important that if you're the kind of person who works hard in life, and whether you make a lot of money or not, but let's say somebody works hard, makes a lot of money, and someone will tell them, you should make sure that you're enjoying this. Like, you're working so hard, you should definitely reap the rewards of it in terms of enjoyment. And that's a really good kind of thought to have. And that's true of an entire culture. That if people are working hard, they're spending their lives doing this, and in particular, the people who are doing the most are being told that it's not good, and deriving much less enjoyment from it. And then a lot of people aren't engaging in it at all, or engaging in it much less, or not aspiring to help master nature because they believe that it's bad. And I have this, so there's this element of we're doing a lot of good stuff. We can do more, and enjoy it a lot more, and it's the philosophy that's holding us back. So I'm again really, really grateful to you for putting forward good philosophical ideas on this topic, because it's very rare. I mean, very, very rare to do so. Yeah, and I think that, so I'm eager to help spread some of your work, and people can start by checking out A Duty to Offend, which is, I think I was able to order from Amazon, so it's available now, right?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Anything else of yours that people should check out? Spike-online.com is the website, right?
Absolutely. They should read Spiked. That is where they will find a lot of these arguments spelt out in a lot of detail.
All right, Brendan. Well, thanks so much for coming on, and thanks for all of your work.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks again to Brendan for being on the show. I think I covered just about everything I wanted to. Oh, I had one thought about the precautionary principle, which I was in Belgium earlier this week. I'm trying to get oriented because the time changed and stuff. But yeah, late last week, early this week. And it's interesting because the idea of the precautionary principle is much bigger overseas than it is here. But generally it has to do with, you shouldn't engage in some new technological endeavor until you can prove that it won't be damaging, which has obvious problems with it, because how can you disprove such a thing? I mean, because somebody can always make up new ways in which it, quote, could be damaging. But I thought of this in connection, and I apologize in advance if this thought isn't fully coherent, but I thought of it in connection with the idea of unlocking nature's secrets, because Brendan was emphasizing that, and I was thinking it's an interesting avenue to emphasize about part of our mastery of nature is our intellectual penetration of it, understanding of it, discovery of its mechanisms. And part of what the precautionary principle is saying is, your intelligence isn't really intelligence. You can't actually understand the way things work. in a way such that you can engage in new things and generally reap positive results, because there will be because you can't really understand things, and for all you know, what seems like something really beneficial will be in effect a bomb that will ruin nature. So there's just always this view that we can't intelligently proceed because we can't really understand the world in a meaningful way. Because of course, if we had complete understanding of it, then and of all the different mechanisms, then of course we could proceed in an intelligent way. Now we don't have that, but we have a progressively growing amount of understanding of the mechanisms, and as a result, we should have more and more confidence in our ability to do things intelligently, and that can even include testing things out in certain ways, to discover new mechanisms or to look for unforeseen mechanisms. But it's really interesting how fundamental the issue of man's mind is to all of this, and how contempt for or denial of the mind is involved in everything. So the precautionary principle is denying knowledge, and the what we call the parasite principle, maybe, or the view of man as parasite, is denying the mind's role in creating. And with the pollution aspect, it's really man viewed as a mindless consumer, exploiter, despoiler. But it's just that he is unintelligent and senseless and self-destructive in just gobbling things up and spewing things out and dumping waste. I guess he's unintelligent in regard to the issue of waste and byproducts. So in all of these, it really comes down to your perspective on the mind. And if you view man as having a mind and you view it as efficacious, then the relationship toward the rest of nature can be mastery. If you view the mind as illusory in its efficacy, then the relationship to the rest of nature has to be submission and abstinence. So anyway, that's some of my off-the-cuff thoughts about that, but I found that clarifying. It's always interesting to hear what other people emphasize, because it can trigger a lot of progress in one's own mind. Anyway, that's all for now on that issue. Of course, we'll be revisiting it over and over and over until we live in a humanist world. As always, if you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail, email me at alex@industrialprogress.net. Terms of following us, make sure to go to industrialprogress.com, sign up for the newsletter, follow us, whether as me, as I Love Fossil Fuels, I Love Nuclear, Center for Industrial Progress. You can follow all of those, or just a couple, on Facebook and on Twitter. Next week, we will be back with another great guest, another great show. Until then, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been Power Hour.
Power Hour. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of energy. Power Hour. The antidote to shallow thinking about energy issues.